something has changed in Trump's perception of the conflict in Ukraine in recent weeks. I think we can pinpoint it firstly to that call he had with Zelensky, but also it seems Melania pointing behind the scenes that he was being made to look a fool.
With me is the Times' Washington correspondent George Grylls. Hi, George. Ukrainian social media users have been sharing pictures of Melania Trump wrapped blue and yellow flags or wearing the trident emblem of Ukraine. Are they right to celebrate her for Donald Trump's change of stance here?
There's a rather intriguing insight into the influence that Melania Trump has over the president's view of foreign policy when he announced earlier this week that the US would be delivering more weapons, massive supplies, in the words of Mark Rutte, of weapons to Ukraine. And he said, he basically accused Putin of stringing him along. He said that, even though he had very nice conversations with the Russian leader, that nevertheless, when he got home, his wife would turn to him and just kind of subtly say to him, "Oh, have you not seen all the missile strikes the Russians have been launching against Ukrainian cities?" Which was basically seemed to be a way in which she was gently nudging her husband to realise that perhaps he was being played.
So a bit of gentle nudging from someone who, to the public, is perhaps a little inscrutable. Is there something about her background that might have prompted her suspicion about Vladimir Putin?
Well, Melania Trump is obviously she was born in former Yugoslavia, behind the Iron Curtain, not a country that has renowned great ties with Russia. And I mean, she's pretty cautious about what she says publicly about her own political views. But for example, after the invasion of Ukraine back in 2022, and bear in mind this was a time, in the same month that Putin launched the invasion, Trump was praising Putin for being, I think he called him a genius and savvy and all this sort of stuff. Nevertheless, Melania took a very different tone, and she said that her heart was breaking at seeing innocent civilians targeted, and appealed to people to donate to the Red Cross because she was basically appalled at the situation in Ukraine. So she obviously had developed views, and we know that she still has links to Slovenia and Eastern Europe, which is obviously broadly pretty supportive of Ukraine and would be basically appalled by the idea of the US withdrawing military support.
The tabloid press often write about how Melania isn't always in the White House. Does that make it perhaps tougher to influence the president's policy positions?
Well, bear in mind, she has been married to the man for over 20 years. So if there's someone in his orbit who understands how to get through to him, it's probably her. And I just thought the way in which she approached, trying to persuade Trump to her point of thinking was not, usually people think that they have to paint things in vivid colors and appeal to the Trump in a very direct way. In fact, she took a much more a much subtler approach, and it appeared to pay dividends.
It's perhaps the opposite of this idea of buying TV ads in West Palm Beach or on Fox News. Just trying to turn around Melania Trump's views would perhaps be an easier route.
Maybe, but I mean, we don't really know the extent to which she's willing to get involved in different areas of foreign policy. We do know she was kind of revising up on her understanding of global affairs before coming back into the White House for a second term, basically in preparation for hosting world leaders at the White House. So, what her exact views are is pretty opaque. We don't actually know, but we were given a hint essentially, and it was an intriguing one.
I suppose it's not new for first ladies to bring their own policy agendas to the White House. If you think back to Laura Bush, she was very big on public libraries. Michelle Obama talked a lot about childhood obesity. Could the plight of Ukraine be Melania's defining issue? Is that something, do you think, she would seek to happen?
No, I think it's too political an issue in the US for her to wade into it, because it kind of cleaves the MAGA supporting base for Trump in two. On the one hand, you have Republicans like Lindsey Graham, who are very supportive of Ukraine. And then on the other hand, you have isolationists like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who very much believe in kind of halting US support for Ukraine. So I think it's too toxic a debate for her to wade into. Instead, she'd rather kind of be seen. For example, we saw her in the aftermath of those floods in Texas going down, and almost like a kind of royal, an American royalty offering kind of condolences and that sort of public presence rather than necessarily wading into one of the most kind of controversial areas of US policy at the moment. Nevertheless, I think what this shows is that behind the scenes, even if publicly she's not going to kind of always be out there making speeches and being, like other first ladies who are kind of pretty prominent figures in their own right, campaigning on certain issues. Although she has, made, for example, kind of online safety one area that she's kind of looked into, but again, it hasn't been a kind of a big driving force. But anyway, so I think that she will mostly be behind the scenes, influencing on Ukraine rather than kind of going out and making a song and dance about it.
You touched on how this support for Ukraine has become a political issue within MAGA. How are the faithful in Trump's supporters reacting to his 180-degree flip this week?
Well, he couched it in by talking about how Ukraine will be paying. Well, Europe will be paying for the aid to Ukraine, so American companies will be benefiting. American workers will be benefiting. So he said, we're not paying a single cent for this, and that was his way of trying to sell it. I think MAGA is actually more riled by other rows at the moment. So one of them is about Jeffrey Epstein and the decision not to release files concerning his suicide. But then you also had the kind of lingering effects of the U.S. intervention in Iran, which many in Magaland were not happy about either. So as yet, there hasn't been a kind of explosion of anger over it, but that's mainly because there are other issues that are kind of dividing MAGA world. And to be honest, you can see it almost as those MAGA figures who did not get a role in the administration seem to be the most kind of vocal critics, and you can kind of see why.
So a pitch to MAGA that the supply of weapons will create jobs and opportunities for the country that they're not paying for. The other element of what Trump's meeting in the Oval Office was focused on was the severe sanctions and the secondary tariffs. We look at Russia's wartime economy, it shrugged off the earlier attempts by the West to isolate it. Could these sanctions, these tariffs, be different for Russia?
Yeah, these would be, I mean, Lindsey Graham described them as sledgehammer tariffs, and they would be because it would be a way. I mean, what Russia has succeeded in doing is that even though it has been cut off from the economies of Europe and America, it has created, or it has access to alternative markets that are huge, i.e., China and India primarily, where it can sell oil and gas. So what these tariffs would do, I mean, there's slightly different versions of them, but in Graham's proposal, you would have 500% tariffs on goods coming from China and India, so countries that import Russian oil, gas, and uranium. 500% tariffs would be levied on their goods going to the US. I mean, Trump actually referred to 100% tariffs instead. I mean, I think these figures are kind of almost decided arbitrarily, but basically, it would be a way of forcing China and India to choose. Either you keep buying Russian oil and gas, or you keep exporting to the US, but you can't have both.
We haven't heard too much reaction from Russia or China yet, but from India or China yet. But we have heard from Russia. Their foreign minister says they'll cope with any sort of sanctions. Others within the Russian administration say they're pointless theatrics. And markets in Moscow shrugged off the idea of this 50-day deadline. Are we talking about another taco moment? That's the slightly odd phrase we hear from Wall Street, taco.
Definitely something has changed in Trump's perception of the conflict in Ukraine in recent weeks. I think we can pinpoint it firstly to that call he had with Zelensky, but also it seems Melania pointing behind the scenes that he was being made to look a fool by the fact that on the one hand, Putin was talking about a possible ceasefire, and on the other hand, simultaneously launching airstrikes on, or some of the heaviest airstrikes of the war so far on Kiev and other Ukrainian cities. So something has changed in his mindset. Whether they will ever put these sorts of tariffs on India and China, I think that seems pretty unlikely, because that would cause huge kind of disruption to the world economy. And judging by what has previously happened with tariffs, Trump has tended to kind of put it off and put it off. We've already seen a delay on the kind of until August of the other tariffs that are on the EU and other countries around the world. So I think that's what the markets are kind of expecting to happen on this. That said, it is not insignificant that he has started to turn the weapons taps back on and allow Ukraine to at least buy American Patriot interceptors and other weapons that are absolutely crucial if they are to prevail.
Lindsey Graham talked about a sledgehammer. Donald Trump says this could be the way to get the ceasefire with Russia. Well, how serious would the consequences for the domestic US economy be if this bill, or if Trump unilaterally kind of ordering tariffs does make it through?
Massive. It would lead to a spike in inflation beyond what we've already seen. So it would cause huge problems for Americans consumers. Yeah.
George Grylls, the Times Washington correspondent, thank you very much.
Thank you.